Good evening, everyone. My name's John Dewar. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Trobe University. It's great to see so many of you here. A warm welcome. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet this evening and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So welcome to tonight's Ideas and Society event, Do Trade Unions Help or Harm Australia's Economy and Society? Now, this is the last event in this year's Ideas and Society series. And in fact, this is the 10th year that Robert Mann, our Emeritus Professor of Politics and Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, has presented the Ideas and Society series. And I congratulate Rob for putting on a terrific series of debates and discussions during the course of 2019. Just to remind you what's been going on this year, we had Hugh White and Clive Hamilton talking about how Australia should respond to China's rise. Tim Suparmazan, Chelsea Bond, Tom Switzer and Tasneem Chopra considered whether Australia still has a serious racism problem. Clementine Ford, Tila Reid and Petra Buskins discussed what type of feminism do we need today. Julian Burnside and Frank Brennan talked about refugees who come to Australia by boat, and we were joined on Skype by a Manus Island detainee, Kurdish writer Behrouz Bashani. Gillian Triggs and Greg Craven, this was a feisty one, talked about whether Australia needs a Charter of Human Rights. And Bob Brown, David Ritter, Amanda Cahill and Maisha Moyne considered strategies for climate change action. Now, if by any chance you missed any of those events, you'd be pleased to know that they've been broadcast on ABC Radio National's Big Ideas programme and are therefore available as podcasts. They're also available as a La Trobe University Clever Conversations podcast, which also includes all of our other public events, including our Bold Thinking series. Now, a lot of the events I've just described were held under the banner of the La Trobe Debates, a series of some of Australia's most significant yet most polarising issues. And we've heard from those with fundamentally different points of view, as well as those with similar points of view, but with different ideas about strategy and tactics. And tonight's event is part of the La Trobe Debate series, and I think, although we'll find out as we go through, that tonight's discussants fall into the category of those with fundamentally different points of view. And I'll introduce them in a moment. But first, let me say something about tonight's topic, trade unions. And I think just saying those two words is often enough of itself to spark a debate. On the one hand, there'll be those who evoke Adam Smith's invisible hand and tell us that we should just leave it to the market to find its own equilibrium. And they might argue that everyone, including workers, will be better off if we resist interfering in the exchange of labour and capital. In the other corner, there will be those who say that business owners, or perhaps even university vice-chancellors, are only worried about the bottom line, and without union advocates, will have no incentive to protect workers' rights. And it's rare that you can open a newspaper or watch television news without hearing about comments made at, let's say, a CFMEU meeting, about reports of underpayment in various sectors. I think Woolies are the latest to announce that they've underpaid their workers, or the expulsion even of union leaders from the Labour Party. Or perhaps a story on declining union membership, or the government's plans to introduce so-called union-busting legislation. And all the while that this is happening, the world of work is changing rapidly. Digital disruption is rendering many occupations obsolete, especially in the manufacturing sector. And we're moving to a service economy with more people in part-time jobs. And then there are those in the so-called gig economy. And women are the fastest growing sector of trade union membership. So given all of these trends, what role should trade unions play? Are they a relic of the past, or are they even more essential in an increasingly automated but complex society? So tonight's discussants are extremely well qualified to consider these questions, and it's my great pleasure to introduce them now. And I'll start with Bill Kelty, on my immediate right, who's had a long career in the union movement, including serving as an industrial officer with the Federated Storemen and Packers Union and as research officer for the Workers' Education Association in Adelaide. He had a 25-year career with the ACTU and was its secretary from 1983 to 2000, during which time the Prices and Income Accord was developed. Bill has held numerous board appointments with private and public companies and was a director of the Reserve Bank of Australia and a member of the Afl Commission. His current board appointments include Lynn Fox Group Director, Virtual Communities Director and Luna Park Board Director. Most importantly, he has a Bachelor of Economics degree from La Trobe University and was amongst the university's first graduates. In fact, I think Bill probably graduated ahead of almost everyone else. He worked so hard, he completed his degree in record time. He was also a very valuable member of the La Trobe University Council, and in 2017 was awarded an honorary doctorate from La Trobe University. Jennifer Westacott, AO, has served as Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia since 2011. She previously worked in senior leadership positions in the New South Wales and Victorian governments across a range of portfolios, including housing, education, infrastructure, planning, and natural resources, and then became a senior partner at KPMG. She's currently chair of the Mental Health Council of Australia and a non-executive director of Wesfarmers Limited. She's the Australian co-chair of the Australia-Canada Economic Leadership Forum, the co-patron of Pride and Diversity, and co-chair of the Australia Sino 100-Year Agricultural and Food Safety Partnership. Jennifer holds a Bachelor of Arts with honours from the University of New South Wales, who also awarded her an honorary doctorate in 2017. Big year for honorary doctorates. Now, tonight's moderator is La Trobe superstar Andrea Carson, a political scientist and associate professor in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at La Trobe. She's written many articles on Australian politics, election campaigns and digital media. She's currently working on an Australian Research Council-funded project that's investigating the media's role in political debate and policy decisions. She's taught courses on journalism, political communication, women in politics, and campaigns and elections, and has worked during a very distinguished career as a newspaper journalist, editor, broadcaster, and producer. The format for tonight will be that Bill, first of all, will deliver an address, followed by an address from Jennifer, and then a discussion facilitated by Andrea, making sure all the time that we have plenty of time for Q&A from the audience at the end. So it's now my great pleasure to hand over to Andrea to get things underway. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that very warm welcome, and welcome to you all. It's lovely to see so many people here when it's such beautiful weather outside. To address the debate question of whether trade unions help or harm Australia's economy and society, I now invite our prized student, Bill Kelty, to make it to the podium.
Good, thanks very much. Great pleasure to be here. When I walked into this building, I think it's one of the most wonderful building in Melbourne. And the reason a wonderful building, it typified what Melbourne was and Australia was when unionism was built in this country. And the very essence of the Australian political way was built here. It was built with a very unusual union movement who worked with employers, established the first minimum wage boards in the world, was supporting women getting the vote, established the Labor Party, and was so successful, working together in this third way, had the highest living standards in the world, which led all the revolutionaries who said this is a terrible system. Lenin had to write a little diatribe about why the Australian way won't work, why Australian unions were no good. So I always get a sense of pride about these places. Now, the one great advantage of getting old, there's only one great advantage, I assure you, is perspective. Now, what I do have is the advantage. I have the advantage of looking at this issue from the perspective of an aspiring young person, aspiring to do good things for this country, from being a practitioner who worked there for 30 years, and now having worked with Lindsay Fox, not just the top end of town, mate, number 3 Collins Street, a procurer capital. So I have a perspective to look at this issue from those 3 sources. When I was young, there are 4 things that I hated. I hated the fact that my mother didn't get equal pay. doing the same job as a man, raising 4 kids by herself. I hated the fact that she didn't get equal pay. I hated the fact that healthcare for us was marginal. If your brother or sister was sick, it just depended on how much money you had the next day, whether you could go. And I loved Nelson Mandela and hated apartheid. I hated apartheid, and I opposed the war in Vietnam to the very last breath. So when I went to the trade unions and looked at what they were doing and talked to them, no wonder I wasn't inspired by them. I was inspired by them. Fighting for equal pay. We organised the first anti-war rally here in Melbourne, and we got 17 people in 1964. 17 people came along. And the people said, you've got to use the unions. 6 months later, using the unions, we got 700 people. So the union organisation for cause. So I couldn't help to work for the unions. The thing that I wanted to do in life was to work for the unions to make society better and to make the economy better. I just couldn't wait. That's why I left university. I couldn't wait to work for them. And when I walked into the Storeman and Packers Union and saw women getting 85 cents an hour, 85 cents an hour, not equal pay, dismal wage rates, treated so badly that they went on maternity leave, they lost all their benefits. So progressively over the 30 years, to test whether unions actually do make society better, it's not some theoretical debate here. Just walk out into the street. Look at the workforce today. 4 weeks annual leave, 38-hour-week standards. Affirmative action for women in the labour movement began in the ACTU. We initiated that at the ACTU. Equal pay for women. And some of the really big issues, the big generational covenants, national health care, national superannuation, and national minimum rates. The unions did this. The unions did this, working with others, working with the good employers, working with community groups. And did we fight for the things we believed in? We did fight for the things we believed in. We fought for Nelson Mandela. We had bans and strikes that this country had never seen before on any political issue. And the biggest industrial political dispute in this country, 2 of them, were over Medicare, to establish Medicare. So when you look at this accretion of what this society has done, the unions have been part of it. Not by themselves, not just simply by themselves, with good people working for good cause. Now you're therefore asking me why. I transitioned from Secretary of the ACTU to working with Lindsay Fox, a good friend, a source of great capital, big companies. And I haven't lost for one moment, not for one moment, have I lost my love for unions, not for a second. Although I work with very, very rich people. And the thing I believe in, see, I never believed Australia was a class-based society. I never believed it was a contest between capital and labour. I never believed that Marxian nonsense. I believe that what makes societies better is improving the living standards of working people. And you do that by working with the best of the employers. You're working by making sure the capital works effectively for them and with them. So I don't, in any sense, say that it's a transitional class. But what have unions been? From the outside, looking in, not the inside looking out. I see a union movement that fought so hard to keep the minimum wage system and work choices. They fought so hard and they won. And they won. I saw a union movement that worked proudly with the gay and lesbian movement, working to ensure that women and men who had a sexual preference were treated honourably, not leading it, but as part of that community. And I have worked at Lynn Fox, a highly unionised employer. Never once have we had a dispute about unionism. We've had disputes with unions, but never a dispute about unionism. And the union has worked productively and capably with Lynn Fox as it has grown to Australia's largest owned transport company. Australia's largest, very profitable, very, very wealthy, but the living standards of all the drivers have improved. The living standard of all the employees has improved. Not working against unions, but working for unions and with unions about the thing that counts. Their members and the employees, the same people, not different people. And about that, there's a commonality of interest. I worked at the AFL as a commissioner, the longest serving AFL commissioner, and there was a contest about sport. The contest was very simple. Let it be a professional show and pay the stars a lot of money. Rugby league went that way. We went the other way. We said, let's work with a union. Let's look after all of the players and all of the coaches and all of the umpires. Let's look after the collective welfare of the people who are involved. Now, it was the best set of negotiations Andrew and Mooch ever had when the employer walked in and offered a 26% wage increase to start with. It wasn't a bad start. But we worked with the Players Association to better the game. And you look at the divergence between rugby league and AFL, it began in that period on that premise. We looked after the whole of the community. Rugby league went their way, they went looking after the stars, we went looking after the players. So I see unions can work productively and capably with employers. Wealth is created for all of us and not just some of us. The most important thing about unions, I'll conclude with this. People discount it, but they are the generational transitions. They transition you from one generation to another. So if you want to make a wage claim and convert it into superannuation and go to a workplace and say you've got a choice, wages or super today, most people, just for their own interest, for that day, will choose wages. But when you say we are asking you to make a generational decision, what is best for your retirement and what is best for your children, trade unions put their hand up, for a generational change. Why didn't Australian unions follow the US model about healthcare? They didn't want corporate healthcare. They wanted collective national healthcare. We could have got healthcare on a corporate basis, like the United States unions, for 10 or 15% of the workforce. We could have made their life actually a bit better. We negotiated it. It took us 1 week in the oil industry and we broke the back there, but we never wanted it. We wanted national health care. We wanted a generational social change, and the unions put up their hands for it, and they were the transitioning agent for it, as they are the transitioning agent for superannuation. You need people who aren't just there for that day or that week. And if you want reform in a country, you've got to negotiate with agencies of change, which carry you from one set of years to another set of years. And unions are capable of doing it, and they have done it over the very biggest issues. And the final thing I think unions are just wonderful for is they are key elements of a social, democratic, pluralist society. That's what they are. I've never once argued against employer organisations. Not once in my entire life. I might argue with them about an issue, but not over whether they're right to exist. They are fundamental to our plurality of democracy. It's a different form of democracy. It's a plurality of democracy, a plurality of ideas, a plurality of organisations. It is an essential part. And that is why when you pass the history books and do the economics assessment, you'll find societies written as great societies. The 1880s to 1900 England, great society. And one of the things they always say, a great society which liberated the right of people to join unions. Australia went the third way, as I said at the outset. Tony Blair once saw us with Paul Keating. And Tony Blair went on and on and on and on about the third way, and he's prattling on. And Paul Keating, after listening to Blair for basically 45 minutes, giving a lecture about the third way, said, "Tony, I think we went the third way in the 1980s, mate. So that's enough. We've heard enough. We've heard enough. Roosevelt's great USA, making a great society, has one of its components, a pluralist, democratic union recognition. And you don't have to be a genius to work out, that after the war, an essential ingredient on making Japan a more democratic society and Germany a more democratic society was in fact the recognition of unions and integration of them in the model. Unions are not perfect, but they have made this country and continue to make this country a better place and a better economy. A better place and a better economy. There's always 2 points that people raise in this debate, and I'm not saying you will raise it, is it all doesn't matter. That's the past. Bill, you're living in the past. You're living in the past. Well, I'll just refer you to 2 texts, not radical extreme left-wingers, not Looney Tunes, not Jeremy Corbynites, not some crazy people who can't spell Marx. 2 people. Piketty's Capital in the 21st century, a great, wonderful French economist of enormous intellect, and the other one is Lord Adair Turner, an old Tory converted to a social reformer. So what he says about the future world is this: capital is increasing at a faster rate than labour input. Adair Turner says that with artificial intelligence, what's happening is a workforce being fundamentally changed. Fundamentally changed. You get some higher paid jobs, some lower paid jobs, and a huge increase in service industries and service jobs. Productivity is diffused or irrelevant. Now, these are 2 observers of what they think the world is like. Now, in that, they say one thing is important, is distribution. It's distribution. And I agree with them. And unions are agents of distribution. They are. Essentially, they're there to help distribute the goods effectively and fairly. The second thing that people always used to say to me, the problem with you, Bill, as a union official, you don't understand this. You don't understand unions do not create wealth. Unions do not create wealth. Well, I'm interested to note that the 5 biggest financial organisations in 30 years' time will have been created in the back room of the ACTU. We created them. Every industry fund, we created. ISPT, we created, along with other people. We created financial institutions out of super. Now, it is not unions' job to create wealth, but it is unions' job to understand how wealth is created and be involved in that creation of wealth. Now, somebody said this will all be class. This will be a class-based examination of you representing labour and other people representing capital, but that's the Eden Blighton view of society. Because in 30 years' time, the biggest owners of capital, in the biggest capital reform ever in the history of this country, will be working people. Will actually be working people. So the contest is not about unions, not about employer organisations, it's about how you work together in a dynamic economy to increase growth and share it effectively. That's the test. And about that, there's no better partner than unions. No better force in a pluralist democracy than unions. And no greater pressure for working people to be represented by than unions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. In the spirit of the contest of ideas, I now invite Jennifer to the podium.
Well, I think you're going to be very disappointed if you thought we were going to have a conflict, because I agree with everything Bill just said. And can I acknowledge him and his great contribution to Australia? I think all of us in this room tonight share a vision to build a better country. I doubt there are many ambitions for the country that Bill and I don't agree on. We want people to have a good job, a better job, a good job for life. We want Australians to have a good home, good health, and have the skills and training they need to get ahead. We want Australia to be able to compete and succeed in a very dynamic world. We want Australians to be safe, to be secure, and we want to be able to manage the enormous technological transition underway in our workplaces. We want systems and institutions that protect the most vulnerable people. After all, what's the point of societies? How do you measure a society? You measure it and their success on how they treat the most vulnerable people, not the strongest people. And I'm sure Bill and I agree on these things, and that most of us in this room agree on these things. So I think tonight it's not about having a debate, but a discussion in the way Bill just left it, about the way unions and capital work together to achieve those ambitions for our country. And I think it's true that Australians have got conflict fatigue, so let's draw the line under combativeness and get on with some stuff. So let me start with this. I fundamentally believe that unions have a huge role in building that stronger Australia. I was a member of a union right up until the time I left the public service, including when I was a departmental secretary. If I didn't believe in unions, I wouldn't have been a member of one. Unions have been fundamental to the well-being of our society. So my starting point tonight is that I have a passionate belief that unions have, will and will always have a vital role to play in our economy and in a better society. In my experience, people often have very fixed views of unions and of business. In terms of perceptions of the Australian union movement, I'd say most people who have a view on the matter fall into one of sort of 5 categories, and that category depends on their beliefs and obviously their position in the workforce. These categories are, first of all, the tribal loyalists, those who have a philosophical commitment to unionism, a belief in solidarity and the natural distrust of employers. The pragmatic consumers, the individuals who choose to join unions if the service is good. They are happy to be part of the team but are not philosophically rusted on. The insurance policy holders, people who treat union membership like insurance. They don't take much interest in it but pay for it in case they need it one day. The sceptical realists, those who see unions in the way many people see banks. They don't necessarily like them, but understand that we need them and they'll always have a role to play. And finally, what I call the anti-union fetishists. Generally, these are not found in positions in business which actually deal with real people and manage real workforces. They exist in the political and philosophic realms and largely operate in the abstract. And I think the extent of their size and influence is often overstated by unions themselves. So if I go think about those categories, I want to explore why I do have concerns that the traditional positive role of the union movement is in some areas diminishing. And I do wonder whether the union movement is the same one that existed in Bill's day. I wonder whether we've developed a disproportionate focus on campaigning for regime change versus the long-term interests of the country, which in turn serves the long-term interests of workers. A single focus on regime change will be the union movement at its worst. And the greatest risk of short-term campaigning focus is, of course, the risk of overstatement or misrepresentation of trends. For example, the claim that the workforce is now excessively casualised is simply not true. The level of casualisation hasn't changed for about 20 years. That's the Productivity Commission saying that, not me. But there are important issues concerning underemployment, the so-called gig economy, the rise of part-time work. And these issues are worthy of discussion. So let's have that debate about those issues, and let's do that by getting the facts on the table. The issue of wage decline in Australia is a serious one, and we must join forces to improve productivity and increase wages, which I'll return to later. But to characterise that wage decline as an anti-business agenda, as a kind of them and us debate, does not allow us to solve it. I believe unions are at their worst when they not only fail to evolve with the times, but instead act like ideological obstructionists, standing in the way of crucial reforms that will create more jobs and better services for the sake of it is not the way to build prosperity. Take, for example, the complete rejection of the concept of free trade agreements versus the legitimate debate about skilled migration and the need to grow our skills in Australia. Or take the example of painting technological transition as a scare campaign versus ensuring workers have access to the skills and training they need to keep pace with that change, and that employers have the capacity to adapt and be agile so they can stay in business. And finally, unions are at their worst when they see a culture of bullying and intimidation as a badge of honour. It is not. It is shameful cowardice. It is a turn-off to the community. It unleashes the anti-union fetishists, and it cripples the enterprise agreement system, which has at its core the principle of good faith bargaining. And this is why the government's integrity bills should pass the Senate. Unions are at their best when they are collaborating to solve a problem, acting in the interests of their members and making a contribution to society. Unions are at their best when they're fighting for safety in our workplaces. Today, Australian companies, in collaboration with unions, can deliver a masterclass about managing safety, particularly on large projects. And of course, collectively, we should never take our eye off that. Unions are at their best when they campaign for equal wages for men and women. Unions are at their best when they're working for outcomes in the interests of Australia over the long term, as they did under Bill, Martin Ferguson, Simon Crean and Bob Hawke. To return to my 5 typologies, back in Bill's day, when there was a drive for consensus, we could have added a 6th category to our list, that of collaborative modernisers. They could be found in both business and unions. They understood economic realities, they genuinely believed in shared benefits through collaboration. They realised that unions, just like businesses, had to adapt to new realities. And the basis of this collaboration was an understanding of the importance of economic growth. And some of the achievements of that collaboration were the wage restraint of the 1980s and 90s to defeat inflation, the introduction of enterprise bargaining, and the support for the reduction in tariffs. Now let me turn to the role of business. We cannot afford for either business or unions to be burdens on society. We must work together. And it would be wrong of me not to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of business. But let me make it clear, I'm always amazed that the interests of business are somehow seen as at odds with the interests of the community. Businesses are people. They're the 11 million people who work in a business. They're the people who own shares, which is overwhelmingly tied up in superannuation. They are the customers, the contractors, the suppliers. That's who is a business. And business is at its best when it's creating a job for someone, when it's creating a return for someone, when it's building something in a community, and when it gives good services to its customers. Business is at its worst when it has a short-term single focus on financial return only, often at the expense of its customers. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Acting ethically, acting in the interests of your customers is not at odds with acting in the interests of your shareholders, because you are going to create long-term value. I believe both business and unions are vital parts of our economic and social fabric. We both need to be at our best to confront the challenges Australia faces. It's paramount that we address our stagnant productivity. Improving productivity will always be a key ingredient to delivering higher wages. This requires a joint effort on competitiveness, on investment and skills. We should be natural allies on competitiveness because it is what creates more jobs. And of course, by productivity, I don't mean working harder for less. I mean doing things better, working smarter so that benefits can be passed on to workers through higher pay and better conditions. And we should do everything together to make sure that businesses invest and stay in this country. This brings me to how workplaces operate. Today, I call again for a meeting between employers and the union movement to sit down and save the enterprise bargaining system. We must work together to address the system which is slowly collapsing in front of our eyes. And that system was born out of that era of consensus. It drove higher productivity, it drove higher wages. And the next big challenge to address is our failing skills system, our failing vet system collapsing in front of us. Together, unions and business must find a way of getting existing workers to access the retraining so they can keep pace with technological change and stay in work. Our research shows there will not be massive job destruction, but tasks within jobs will change. It must be business working cooperatively with unions to own that transition, but we need a skills system and an industrial system to make that easier. We need a fair and just transition in our workplaces. I'm particularly concerned about people in small and medium-sized businesses who may be vulnerable to gradual dislocation because they cannot retrain and reskill. The government's making some progress on this with the Skills Commission and a Careers Institute, but this is an area of natural alliance between unions and employers. Perhaps it might also be important and appropriate that we revisit a Bill Kelty era concept of a training compact to better enable us to reskill Australian workers. And there are, of course, other areas where we can and should join forces in the national interest. Why shouldn't unions and business work together to act on energy and the environment? We cannot afford a situation where certain policy choices create limited job opportunities. We cannot afford a situation where no policy choices create uncertainty, no investment, and limited job opportunities. So let's break the impasse and drive the transition to a clean energy future that ensures affordable and reliable energy, that keeps us competitive, that creates new industries, new jobs, and drives technology change in existing sectors. I believe we've got a collective responsibility to make sure Australians retire well. They retire with money in their pockets and they retire with dignity. And importantly, that the retirement and superannuation system comes to terms with the fact that people are going to work much longer. And finally, there are some social challenges where a combined effort will give great effect to change for Australians who need it most. Let's work on inequality, but the problem must be accurately described. It is a problem of deep-rooted and entrenched disadvantage. And I'm always disappointed that the union movement has never supported my call for a Productivity Commission inquiry into entrenched disadvantage. We should, I believe, work together to address the issue of low-paid workers, especially women. We need to place more value on the caring professions, especially childcare, aged care, and not stand in the way of reforms to improve the education and human services system. But make no mistake, a return to the 1970s conflict-driven system of pattern bargaining is no solution to dealing with the conditions of low-paid workers. So now is not the time for a debate about the usefulness of business or unions. Now is the time for collective action from business and unions. Our door is open. We want to work together to make our country stronger, to make our country more competitive, so we can create more jobs, create better jobs with higher skilled people, so we can give people the ability to work longer if they choose, and we can pay them more. That is our collective responsibility. That is our collective objective. That should be what we all focus on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer and Bill. There's a lot of themes there, obviously, that we will be unpacking in the next hour. I want to take you to the time when we had the modernisation of the Australian economy, which you've both touched on in your opening addresses. And that was something that you showed great leadership in, Bill, with the Prices and Income Accord between the ACTU and the Hawke and Keating governments that repaired and renovated an ailing economy. And through trade-offs on both sides, including moderation of wage demands in exchange for improvements to the social wage, it set up a very prosperous time that most of us here have enjoyed right up until the GFC. And although we haven't technically gone into recession in Australia, we have seen a slowing in growth. But the settings have now changed since those times. Back then, the problem was inflation that was in double figures, it was interest rates with double figures, and now we have the reverse of that. We have suppressed wages and we have suppressed inflation. So what is the solution now? What will work now? What is the answer for today's problem of low wage growth that you've both spoken about, underemployment, for some people overemployment, and a low growth economy? Now, I know they're big questions, not easy to answer, so please.
Before you do that, I'd just like for the historical record for the true role of Simon Croon and I to be identified. Bert Evans said, look, Bill Kelty and Simon, they come over as lovely people. You know, they're so kind and they're so concerned. Like, we agree nearly with everything you say. But here's a list of all the industrial disputes they're involved with in terms of getting superannuation. Like, here's 787 industrial disputes they're involved in. This is what they did, fighting us. They were animals, mate. They were truly animals. They would close down the factories on Friday for some group of workers And for others, they would make sure that nobody could work so that people got all their money on overtime. He said they completely, well, you can guess the adjective, I'm told not to say bad words, so I've got to be careful. He said they are lovely people, but they fought like animals. Like John Setka, if he had a dispute every day for the rest of his life, wouldn't even get onto the first page, mate. So we fought really hard for the things we believed in, really, really hard. We had lots of disputes, but we did have dispute for cause. And what we realised very quickly was this. We realised early in this, that if you want a long-term gain, not short-term victory, a Pyrrhic victory, then you've got to have the people who produce the wealth on side. And once they agreed on super, and they're on side, they have been on side ever since. So we played the long game, but did we play it hard? We were so tough. I've got to tell you, we were just so tough. I got involved in more industrial disputes in my life than all the union officials today combined, by myself. By myself, I got involved in more disputes. But we were fighting for cause. And we did realise this, and I learned it at a very early age. I'll just tell you this as a history, why I have these views, is we're fighting to get equal pay for women in the Brushmakers Award. The women are getting $32 a week. And we sat down with this old bloke, he must have been a 75, and he said, Bill, I actually support equal pay. He said, but I can't pay equal pay unless the community pays equal pay, because I actually can't do it by myself. I actually can't raise the rate of women's wages. I just can't do it. But I do absolutely support equal pay. And I said, well, I think you're right. So I knew then it wasn't a monopoly of goodness. You know, when you're young, you only think that you've got the monopoly of goodness. You think you're the person fighting for goodness. But he was a very, very good employer who employed people, wanted to pay more. And did he put his hand up for equal pay? He did put his hand up for equal pay in industrial tribunals. He went along and he said, I support equal pay. A society should not pay women differently than men. And I support it, I just can't pay it alone. So we got the good employers on the side. And half the employers are really good. Half the employers in our stage weren't really good. And we love fighting them. I mean, I really enjoyed it. So this idea of a consensus, get your values right. We passionately care for the same things. So you work with good people about good causes, no matter who they are, and that's what you try to get the coalition of interest for. So if you're looking now in terms of wage rates, we had unemployment of over 10%. We had inflation of 11%. We had the manufacturing industry decimated. So do you think this is a hard problem, do you? Wage rates, instead of growing at 3.5 or 4, growing at 2.5? God, that's a hard problem. That is not a hard problem to fix. That is a hard problem which is fixed by the minimum rate being adjusted faster, sitting down and talking to employers, and so we want to increase wage rates. We would like to see the enterprise bargaining back in system, putting a 3 and 4% in front of people's wage rates as we make sure we've got the adjustment process. That is unions bargaining to get 3 or 4%. They don't have to get 10%, but at least get 3 or 4% and get the wages award system. That is not a hard task. If a nation can't get its wages adjusted from 2.5 to 3.5 or 4, we'll give the game away, mate. Like, it's not such a hard thing to do. And what we have as society says, that's a very hard thing to do. We have the Reserve Bank say, don't worry, when unemployment reaches 4.5, it'll come to pass. It won't come to pass. Because the Reserve Bank, I sat on the show for a long time, doesn't make the wealth. So workers working with unions, working with businesses, saying we want to get the wage rates up, we want to get equal pay, here's an agreement that we can make about things about which we could agree, and then put the economic capacity to implement them.
Jennifer, I see you nodding. If there was one policy setting that the BCA would like to prioritise to change first, what would that be?
Can I have two?
Yeah, have two.
Look, I totally agree with Bill. I think we've got to sit down and say, first of all, how do we get the economy to grow faster? Because to get wages to grow faster, we need the economy to grow faster. And you've got to think about our economy has grown at 3.5% over the last 40 years, is now under 2%. That's just not growing fast enough. So one thing that we have got to do is come to terms with business investment. Now, we obviously fought hard for a company tax change, but if we're not going to do that, we've got to do something else. And at the same time, we've got to, and Bill's made this point publicly, lower that top marginal tax rate, because it is a investment detractor, it's an investment sucker. Now, part of the conversation you'd like to be having in a room is that we're not going to have an ideological conversation. We're not going to have a we hate the top end of town and therefore you buggers are getting nothing conversation. Like, that can't be the starting point. And then the second thing, if I could change anything, I would change that skill system, because we are not ready to equip people with the skills they need to actually stay working all their lives, get these new jobs, get these new opportunities. And, this kind of polarisation of vet and higher education, which treats vet as a second-class citizen and says anyone who's gone to a vet, then, well, that's what the dumb kids do and the smart kids go to uni. We've got to change that as a country and look at things like the German system, where you've got dual-track qualifications, you've got employers and employees embedded in the training system together, working out how those skills are going to work. We've got to modernise that system very quickly.
So hearing those comments from you, were you heartened by the words of the opposition leader yesterday, who's hit the reset button on policy, Anthony Albanese, when he said, and I quote, "One understands that unions and business have a common goal, and that Labor will develop a new national organisation called Jobs and Skills Australia to drive improved outcomes in the vocational education and training sector and strengthen workplace planning." Is that what you want to see more of?
Yeah, I think what he said was terrific. What we now need to do is kind of get beyond that and say, well, what does that actually look like? And it can't just be more money into systems. We know that's not always the answer to things. We need a common information platform between vet and higher education, because if you're an existing worker or a young person trying to work out what you should do, good luck in trying to find out how much you're going to pay for your course, what your job prospects are likely to be, what your loan repayments. Good luck finding that info across both sectors. And I want us to have a lifelong skills account for every Australian, so that, if I need to retrain and reskill, it's not up to my employer to give me that opportunity. I want to see a lifelong skills account, which is a income contingent loan, a subsidy and an employer contribution that allows me to stay working, get a micro-credential, get a module of training so I can stay in the workforce. So I want to see the next layer of what he wants to do, and he and I have had some very good conversations about it. But I was really heartened with his kind of acceptance to Bill's point. It's business and unions working together that's going to make the country stronger, not a polarised view.
Bill, did you want to add to that?
Well, I agree with those suggestions. It's good to see him have an idea. That's refreshing.
Well, in that speech, he also made the point that Australians now need to accept workplace casualisation, which means...
Just to interrupt, Australia's had a very high rate of casualisation, very flexible labour force for a
very,
very long time. Even when employers used to say, oh, we don't have a very flexible workforce. All the reports said we had to have a very flexible workforce. Joe Isaac, who recently died, did a report and said, I don't know what you're talking about. We have a very, very flexible, highly casualised part-time workforce for a long time, for a very long time. So the question is, it can work sometimes and it can work to your disadvantage sometimes. And we know it in terms of Linfox. We prefer actually to have drivers for longer haul, because you've got higher levels of skill, high levels of commitment, high levels of safety. So we prefer long-term job security and low levels of casual and part-time work, and actually better for the enterprise. But sometimes you're competing with just low-cost, casualised part-time people. Now, notwithstanding it all, Linfox are very, very higher payer, more security, has done better than most of the companies because of that reason. So I still think there is an issue of security that we need to address. It's a matter of sitting down, working on what people want, what companies want, and work it out effectively. The labour force is changed dramatically over the period. Now, you can do that, but you've got to understand, young people find it really hard. Look, People pick on young people. They go into the labour force, paying the bloody HECS. They now brought it forward to 28,000. They're paying the HECS. They've got part-time jobs. They've got casual jobs. They're not getting full-time employment now to 25, 26. They've got all these imposts upon them. They've got a marginal tax rate of 40. At 40,000, they've got a marginal tax rate of 32.5%. They're paying back the HECS fees. They're paying the GST. They can't save $1, let alone buy a house. Get off their back. Give more security in terms of employment. I was always in favour. The employer who came to me and said, look, what we'll do is have longer periods of employment for people. I said, fine. You know, we're going to press less in terms of the penalty rates for the short-term aberration because you're investing in the people. We will therefore try to respond with you accordingly. Now, we had a lot of good agreements for employers, but they say they can't compete if the safety nets of society are too low, because it does go to the bottom. Whether we like it or not, all employers aren't good employers. They will pay the lowest possible miserable wage rate that they can. So we've got to lift it up. Work together with good employers to lift it up.
Jennifer, you mentioned that there's a need to lower the corporate tax rate as a driver for business. But what about the point that Bill's just mentioned, if you've got casualisation, and I know with my students and probably many of the people here tonight that have more than one job or two jobs or three casual jobs, and the tax system's not all that conducive to having those multiple jobs. What do you think needs to happen at the lower end?
Yeah, I mean, company tax change is one part of fixing a tax system, but the effective marginal tax rates that hit people at each stage of change, those things are very poor for incentives. I mean, that's why I'm kind of quite a big supporter of what the government's trying to do, which is to get everyone to, basically one tax rate. Now, the question then is that tax rate too high? But, I think you just can't have a kind of ideological view on the top tax rate, for example, because it doesn't take too long to get there, and it's a big deterrent. So I don't think there's any one thing, and this is the problem with reform in Australia these days. You say tax reform, everyone says immediately goes to GST, and then, whoop, that conversation's got to finish. There's lots of tax reform we could do that does not involve the GST. And we've got to we've really got to kind of be lowering people's tax burden. That should be the objective. And we have to lower the tax burden on businesses because we are competing with countries that are got a tax rate of 21%. I mean, did anyone find it strange that our Prime Minister was opening Vizzy's plant in the United States, employing 3,000 Americans, not 3,000 Australians, because they've got a 21% company tax rate, they've got lower regulation. Does anyone kind of think, sorry, that doesn't seem right? I bet the people in Townsville would have loved 3,000 jobs. So I think it's about a more comprehensive view of tax. And I'm always disappointed that the unions and business aren't allies in the competitiveness agenda because the end product will be better jobs. Bill?
Look, as long as Malcolm Turnbull was running around the corporate tax code, the Labor Party was a shoo-in, mate, because absolute shoo-in, because that's not your essential problem. Your essential problem is not in Australia, your corporate tax rate, because your corporate tax, you only hold your tax in the corporate and you put it out. And you put it out through imputation credit. We have a very unusual system which rewards productive capacity, not speculative prices. Therefore, we have an imputation system. So once the money gets out, it gets to the shareholders. The real problem is in the Australian tax system, you've got a top marginal tax rate of 47, and you've got people on 40,000 getting a marginal tax rate effectively, an effective tax rate, if you add all these other things that they have to pay, of 40. That tax system is a crazy tax system. In a world in which capital increases, in which capital is increasing, there's a huge shift to property in terms of wealth creation, because that's where you return it. The tax system is not the best tax system for a society. That is, the tax rates under capital and property have to be increased, but the marginal tax rates that people pay have to be reduced. And that means you reduce it at all levels, including the top marginal tax rate. Because it's crazy to have a tax system which says, I'm rich, and I actually do know quite a lot of rich people, you probably guess, is I'm rich, I won't convert my money into income, I'll convert it into capital, because my maximum tax rate I'm going to pay is 23%. Well, when my daughter's paying 32.5%. And people are paying 47%. It's a crazy tax system for the next generation. It doesn't work. It's not conducive to the allocation of resources. You've got to get the tax system reformed. You don't need a GST, just reform that. But do it sensibly, because you've got capital plans, you've got plans. We did superannuation. We fundamentally reformed the whole capital society, the biggest capital reform in the history of the country. We put it in the hands of employees. We see you've got a total system in which your money goes into account and it accumulates. But there was a defined benefit system which existed. So we didn't say, by the way, you're under defined benefit, and next week you're under our system, because we would have got murdered. They would have ripped us apart. They would have just destroyed us. So we said, you know what, you live with your system. You go and have your system. It's a nice system. I understand it's a really, really good system for you, but don't stop us changing the whole system for everybody else. Don't you sit there with your very, very good system. Stop us changing the whole of the superannuation system to the future. So we'll preserve your benefit. That's fine. You plan for it. If you do the same with tax, don't destroy what people have got. Move to the next generation. And I don't have a pure view. It's not an ideological view. Like a Labor Party supporter, and I've been a Labor Party all my life, since I was 16, supporting a top-rate marginal tax rate, you may find that unusual. But the truth is that the last great reformer of the income tax system, who got the top marginal tax rate down from 60 to 46, happened to be Paul Keating. That is, the Labor Party has owned the bottom and they have owned the top, and they've done it for those reasons. It was a terrible tax system. People didn't pay the 60 unless they were a public servant, they had to pay the bloody 60. A building worker earning 100,000 pay marginal tax rate of 60, you must have been joking.
And yet what you're saying is at odds with where the election was fought in May, particularly the Labor position, which was wanting to scrap franking credits and was...
No, that's franking credit. No, they didn't...
And was holding off on reducing
the
the
franking
top
credits.
tax rate.
They didn't say that. They want to keep franking credits. They didn't want to give franking credits to people who didn't pay tax. We introduced the system. We said this is an offset for tax paying. John Howard knocked out... We transferred super... The LAW tax cuts went to payment for the 3% super as we went from 9 to 15. That was the election commitment. John Howard knocked it off. He knocked off the LAW tax cuts. He knocked the LAW tax cuts off. We didn't. Labor Party didn't, but he knocked it off. And then he used it to fund changes to the superannuation system. We had 15% in, 15% out. You could pay no tax if you put it into an annuity. You see, you don't have to pay any tax on exit. And he gave this benefit called imputation credits to people who didn't pay tax. Now, that's all right. He did it. That was for his people. He got away with it. That's fine. So the Labor Party went to the last election saying you shouldn't have the imputation credits for people who don't pay tax. That's what they went, not to change the imputation credit. Labor Party's got as much chance to change the imputation credit while Keating's alive as I have of completing a 100 metres race in 9.5 seconds. There is no chance we will change imputation credit because he created the stuff, mate. And you want to take on Keating, not even me at the bravest would dare take on Keating. Never take him on about imputation credits. So that was the system. The Labor Party got their tax package wrong because they didn't have a tax package. They had a tax reform and they therefore decided to spend the money. That's not tax reform. It's a very simple proposition. Tax reform equals tax cuts. I know it upsets some people changing the tax system at the top end of town, but if you want tax reform, like Keating got tax reform, that's what you do if you believe in tax reform. If you don't believe in it, just don't do it.
Now, I think it's incumbent upon me to find some points of difference here. And so I want to go to superannuation. And one is how quickly we should be moving as a nation to go to 12%, which at the moment is under review. Josh Frydenberg announced a review last month of September. It was scheduled to go at 2025. I believe, Bill, you called the former Treasurer, Wayne Swan, a miserable bastard for not lifting in the Fin review last week, not lifting the superannuation guarantee by more than 0.5% in the time that Labor was last in. Jennifer, when would you like to see the superannuation increased, if at all?
Look, I think the government's made it very clear they're not going to walk away from the 12%, the increase, and we're not going to encourage them to do that. I think the issue for the inquiry is not that, and it shouldn't be that. It should be a couple of things. It should be, is the system working? So will that increase actually kind of go to increasing people's retirement incomes? And I think the inquiry's got to look at a more complex system, which is imagining a world where someone's going to work, they're going to have a bit of a part pension, and they're going to draw down on their super. And how does the tax system work for that kind of retirement income system? So that's the point of the inquiry. So we're not going to be pushing the government on the 12%. I would like to be confident, having Karen Chester's review, having some of the concerns that people have got about the efficiency of the superannuation funds, the efficiency of the default system. I think people have to be confident that that extra contribution is going straight to the bottom lines of people's retirement incomes. That's the question. Let's not have now another false debate about the 12%. Let's have a debate about how do we make sure that the system is making sure that money is adding to people's retirement incomes.
Bill?
Well, the government gave a commitment, both political parties and the parliament of this country gave a commitment to introduce the superannuation and to increase it to 12%. They can walk away from it. But if parliaments continuously walk away from commitments they give people, then they pay prices for it. You pay price, leave it alone. That's a commitment you gave, just leave it alone. Exactly. Do what you say you're going to do. Dan Andrews won an election. He said, I'm going to do this, and did it. If you say you're going to have super and you're going to increase it to 12, do it. Just do it. It's planned to be done, do it. The parliament's met it, do it. Because otherwise what you have to say, well, bugger the parliament. Bugger the parliament. They bloody change their mind all the time. They deferred it once. They deferred it to enable a wage increase. And as I said, you might be wrong. You may be able to find the single employer in Australia. I can't. Who said, I actually can't find this, but you may know the single employer who said, I noticed that the superannuation has been deferred, therefore I've decided to increase wage rates. I can't find them. I know even a good employer like Linfox, we didn't do it, so there must be somebody out there. I'm sure there's somebody who did it. But to the best of my knowledge, nobody did it. Nobody did that. So it's a silly thing to do. Keep the super to 12. Keep the super to 12. That was the commitment we gave. And keep it. Both political parties should meet that.
I agree.
And we should get over it. Now, I don't say that there's no problems with super. So the tax system is not our preferred tax system. I actually preferred what we had, 15% in, 15% out, you buy an annuity. But that's not the political reality. People hate you changing the super all the time. Hate it. So just leave it there. Do I think it's a nice system? I think it's the best? No, I think it's a bit unfair at the top end. I think that people get a benefit that I wouldn't give them. But I don't care. Leave it there. Just allow Australians in the next generation, because they've got almost the best superannuation system in the world, almost the best superannuation system, allow it to be what it is. Now, there are issues, there are anomalous issues about some aspects of low-paid people paying the 15%. It is an anomalous issue that somebody's paying 15% on their super compared with their income. And if you make it compulsory, that's what you've got to address. Yeah. There are issues with some of the funds.
Exactly.
But just remember this. It is returning on average 9%. 9% it is returning when the rate of increase in wages is 1% and the rate of interest is 1%, and the rate of inflation is 1%. So if you want any proof of whether that Lord Adair Turner's right, and as I said, an old Tory, mate, an old Tory, so he's not some bloody Labor Party henchman, that he's right and Pickett is right, they are demonstrably right, because capital is increasing, the returns to capital are increasing. What we are least lucky in this country, if they are right, we have the best safety net that we have invented. That is, part of the increased return of capital actually goes to working people. We've got that system right now. Everybody else in the world will be struggling to get their hands on such a system if those two are right. But we've got it. So leave it. There's a couple of anomalies that need to be addressed for low-paid people, and just leave it. And don't start pretending that what we're going to do is give low-paid people access to their bloody super in default of getting lower and fixing up the wages system or fixing up the tax system. But if you're so worried about low-paid people, and I am, my whole life I've been committed to look after low-paid people. I don't give a bugger much about the rich. I've got them on my side industrially, but I only cared for and fought for low-paid people because they needed us most. If you want to fix up their problem, fix up the wages system, fix up the tax system, fix up the job system, and most importantly, I think, is fix up the training system. You're right about that.
Now we're going to go to questions in just a moment, and we've got two people with microphones on either side, so please put your hand up if you want to ask a question. And I do ask, given we've got the experts up in front, if you make it a question rather than a statement. Just before I go to those questions, perhaps the elephant in the room, and Bill, you say that you love unions, but it seems not all Australians do. The density of union membership has fallen quite dramatically over the last 4 decades, from 51% now down to about 15%, and the largest membership levels are in police, nursing and education. In fact, the former Assistant Secretary of the ACTU, Tim Lyons, described it as almost impossible to overstate the crisis that is there for the union movement, and if there isn't change now, it will very quickly die. So should the question really tonight be about the relevance of unions to be able to address some of these problems in concert with business, given that fewer and fewer Australians are now belonging to unions?
Well, first of all, I said I love unions, and so does 64% of Australians love unions. That is, when you ask them, do you like unions, they say, yes, we like unions. The 64%, 65% has hardly changed. That is, as a belief in a pluralist society, a belief about unions, as a concept and belief, they actually do support unions, and they do love unions. So what you get is when people say, oh, the rate of density is very low, therefore what I can do is implement a attack on minimum wages, attack on unions. Political parties nearly always lose because the essential position is the majority, overwhelming majority of Australians still believe in Australia's form of unionism. They're still imbued in what they believe because it's part of the character and characteristics of this country. So as to saying I love unions, and the majority of Australians actually still love unions. What is true is the density has fallen because unions have not been able to recruit. Now, I was not always liked as a union official, but by and large I was pretty well received when you argued your point. The worst reception I ever got was in 1985 in the ACTU Congress when I said, if you look at the employment structures and the future economy, Australia will have a rate of unionisation 19% by the turn of the century. Therefore, you've got to change the structures and the way we behave and how we operate. Now, they hated it. They got up and yelled at me, some of them. Now, I'm actually always like that, I'm a very combative person, so I enjoyed the fight. But the worst thing in life is being right about something underneath. That's worse. Unions have not made, in terms of organisational change, all the changes necessary. I think that's true. And I argued that. I argued more with unions than anybody. I was always arguing with people in unions about trying to change and get it done. But on the other hand, it's a bloody hard job. I tell you, you put your upper hand, you run a university and say, by the way, everybody can come here for free, for free. Most of the things unions do are for free. The national wage is for free. The superannuation is by and large for free. The healthcare fight was for free. Everything you do is for free. An enterprise bargain, if you do the enterprise bargain, oh, well, I'm not in the union, I get the bloody money, mate. So unions, as agents industrially, do nearly everything for nothing. Well, it's not a very good business model, I've got to tell you. It is not. Lindsay, with all his... Lindsay, I don't think would do it. I've got to say, if I said to Lindsay, look, mate, just in the spirit of Australia, just making Australia better, don't charge anything for your trucks. Don't you worry, don't you... I think Lindsay, who's a great mate, would say, Bill, I'm not going to do that. Now,
Look, I think a starting point, first of all, you want to see strong union membership. You don't want to see the density fall, for all the reasons Bill and I have just gone through. I think one starting point would be to start to work to save the EBA system. Because I think a lot of people would say, I want to invest in that. I want to pay my fees for that. I want to be part of that. And I think that would be a big starting point. And I think getting on some of these social issues and some of these kind of economic issues such as skills, again, people would say, well, I want to be part of that. It doesn't matter what kind of category of my 5 categories you want to go to, but the pragmatists will say, I'm going to be part of that, because they know that there's a lot of at stake there. But if it's an entity that's about regime change all the time, well, you know, people are going to have different views about that.
We're ready to take questions. Just put your hand up. There's one in the centre there, and then we'll take one at the front. And I'd like to see lots of female voices speaking too.
So it seems that there are, it's perhaps that the union movement hasn't modernised enough, according to Bill. I also think that some of the fetishists that were mentioned before, probably the majority of them seem to be in government. So it's a collective of the two things. But ultimately, business relies on demand, and as the pressure against unions seems from a few quarters to have grown, it seems to inevitably have meant that demand has diminished, and that can't be good for business either.
I agree. Look, you know, this is my point. We need each other. I mean, if you really want to affect productivity, which is going to drive higher wages, you've got to do that at a workplace level, and you've got to have some kind of collective process to bring people together to say, at our workplace, how do we make our enterprise stronger? How do we make your conditions better? And how do we deliver higher wages? You know, doing that, you know, if you talk about very large companies one by one, it's not going to happen. So it is not in businesses' interests to not see a strong union movement, because we will not be able to make some of these big changes, to get on top of some of these big issues. You simply can't do it, even if you kind of forget the philosophy, just take the organising principle. But from a philosophical view, you know, surely as a society we care about the concept of a collective bargain, the concept that the people who are not able to bargain for themselves have a representative body to do it. To me, that's a fundamental part of our pluralist, kind of fairer society. Employers want that. Employers need that. We need it to be high performing. Companies need to be high performing. That's the only way we're going to tackle some of these issues.
Thank you. Question at the front, and then we'll go for one on the side.
Thanks, Andrea. Terrific speeches, both Bill and Jennifer, really passionate and very persuasive. A question perhaps for Bill in the first instance. Bill, the legacy you touched on is quite remarkable, and you spoke about the union's continuing role in terms of for distribution and also as capital holders these days via super, but I still don't get a sense of your conviction or optimism about the union movement really being a part of growing the size of the pie today as it was in the 80s. I just don't see the unions being involved in driving the productivity agenda and increasing the size of the pie today. I wonder if you could comment further.
Well, it's not personal. These things, you should never personalise it. I think the unions are finding it difficult, given the employer opposition, given declining membership in certain cases, because not good declining membership for responsible outcomes. Norm Gallagher, who I really like Norm, I mean, don't get me wrong, actually, contrary to, we ended up having a fight to the death, but it was a fight to the death, but I never not liked him. I always liked him, and I was a very nice person. Said to me, Bill, I don't want more than 8,000 members because I can't control them. I'd rather have 8,000 I control rather than 20,000 I can't control. And I think the problem, if you have declining density, what you do is you get a smaller and smaller representative group that you have to please, because all you have to do is win the election. You know, winning the elections, you don't want to create a circumstances where you lose the election by having more people in it. So lower density doesn't help in terms of a bigger, better outcomes, because it prevents you. The second thing, lower density doesn't help in a more democratic framework. You don't have people in those industries. And unions, despite what you think, basically reflect their membership. Teachers, union officials actually behave like bloody teachers. Police behave like police. Nurses behave like nurses. So they reflect their membership. But if you haven't got a whole group of people in society in terms of some of the new industries, well, they're not there. They're not voices to say, here's changing. So it doesn't help in terms of getting a good democracy ticking over. So, but the task has been hard. Remember, John Howard declared war on them. He didn't say, thank you very much, none of this, nice talk. He said, I'm going straight after you, straight after unions, straight after unionism and straight after the minimum wage rate. Now, even me, who works with employers, understands the role of capital, I think, understands the role of profit. I've never objected to that. I don't make grand speeches about, I'm no bloody Marxist, mate. I am a practitioner, practical person to get a better result for working people. Even me, what did we do? We said, John, if you're going to fight us to the death, we're going to be in with you, mate. And we're going to try as hard as we can to beat the daylights out of you. We're the biggest pickets in the history of the country down in the wharf. And I won't even tell you the other things that we did. I won't even tell you those because it might actually get me into trouble. I noticed that people pick on one union official here saying he's got all these lists of complaints. So I said to you, if they're his list of problems that he created, then I think mine was much bigger. So I won't tell you what we actually did, but did we fight? We fought really hard. What you needed, employers, to say, stop fighting, we're about this agenda, we'll work together to do these things. We'll have our differences. You know, democracy is really good, dissent is really good, because we have our differences. You can have your arguments with your friends, you can oppose people, you can have it. John was on, you know, like I'm always up for the argument, but I like the argument, but I don't proceed on the basis of arrogance. You learn more from people with whom you're having an argument. So I think that sense we've got to get to. So I think they've been, for the most of this century, pushed away and pushed to the side, and people haven't wanted to run an agenda of positive unionism. So if the employers aren't prepared to run it, then what happens? Now people say to me, well, what did the employers do for you, Bill? What did they do for you? You know, you got all your mates, what did they do for you? You know, all the friends, when bloody John Howard came, you know, they all bloody went to water. It's not true, of course, because when John Howard won, BHP did a 5-year agreement. Lindsay Fox did an agreement. All the people with whom we negotiated for the past 10 years put up their hands and said, we're not getting involved, Bill. We're going to be on your side because you were on our side for the last 10 years making the changes. We're on your side.
But
So he could never touch that top 10% because we had them together.
Just on that point, Jennifer, did you say in your opening remarks that you will be supporting the Ensuring Integrity Bill, which has already been through the lower house and is now waiting to go through the upper house? And this is the bill that Senator Rex Patrick from Centre Alliance labelled as a sledgehammer to crack a nut when only a nutcracker is needed, which gives the federal court, if it goes through, the power to cancel and fine unions and their leaders. Why do you support such
well,
a overarching
first of all, it's
bill?
bringing registered organisations in lines with what a company has to do. You know, for people who disobey the law, you know, they can be taken off a board. They get penalties. This is about a kind of common sense bringing that in line. And it's a court that's making a decision, not a minister, a court. So to me, this is like, you know, bringing it in line with what a company is required to do, their responsibilities on directors. I simply don't understand why that is seen in that way. And if we and to your question, which is a very important one, the enterprise agreement system has to be focused on making the country grow faster. And that is about the two entities sitting down together at the enterprise level with the fundamental philosophy: we want the enterprise to succeed, we want it to grow and grow stronger so that people, the employers and the employees share the benefits of that. That is the system that Bill created, that is the system that served us well. That cannot work if there is no integrity in the system. And that's why we support the bill. It's a bigger issue for us. It's about saving the EBA system. It's not just a philosophical view about that. It's about, if that system continues to decline, the very thing you've raised, how do we make the country more prosperous, that is going to be done through that enterprise system and through the minimum wage system, which I agree with Bill. I mean, the BCA's never opposed the minimum wage system. We've always supported it. I think it could be set differently. I think it could be set more fairly, but we've never opposed that system. So unless we get the wage setting and the EBA process working, and unless our common objective is to make the country better off and to grow the size of the pie, to use the jargon, then we will just be running around in circles. But meantime, back at the ranch, the economy will be just floating along the bottom and people's wages won't go up.
Let's get some more questions. We've got one coming through here, then we're going to this side of the room, and then we'll come back to the front here.
Hi, thank you both so much for your contributions tonight and your contributions to making our society better. I think it's really wonderful to be able to see two people engage in good faith in the way that you have tonight and talk about working together. I think it's undeniable that, as Bill was saying earlier, the union movement has advanced women's rights and entitlements in this country in an enormous way. But it was striking to me tonight to notice that it was the union leader on the stage who was continuously interrupting the moderator and his fellow speaker, and it was the business council leader who, when she was asked for a response, said, "Can I have two, please?" I need to make this a question, so I think the question is, maybe we should broaden it because I'm just making that observation, but the question might be, does the union movement need to update its culture in certain ways in order to modernise and to be more attractive to particularly women, but I think perhaps to young people who expect different things from the way workplaces operate?
Thank you.
Majority of our union members are now women. The growth of the union movement has been with women. The best unions in this country, some of them represent predominantly women in terms of nurses. The nurses are about as good as a union in the whole of the world. The two leaders of the ACTU are women. So I don't think that, and they have been an active agent, and in some cases a single most important active agent have been unions fighting for women's rights, and women unionists fighting for women's rights. The affirmative action strategy that the ACTU initiated was initiated by Jenny George, who said not good enough. And we want an affirmative action strategy in the ACTU, and that affirmative action strategy then was adopted by the Labor Party. So I do think that the unions have come a long, long way in terms of women, a long way. Now, as to what they do in respect to other issues is always an issue, but I don't think it could be said generally of the union movement in the last 30 years that they have not been proactive. They've implemented all their charters, they've been active, and they've been one of the leading organisations representing women in terms of this country. So I think that's the truth. That's the truth of the matter.
Jennifer, did you want to make a comment about how business stacks up here with female CEOs?
Look, I mean, this is a huge challenge for the corporate sector. I'm not going to pretend that we don't have a huge problem here.
I think the figures were 7% last year. It's fallen to 6% this year.
And we've got to fix this. And we've got to fix this through, right down to young girls doing STEM at school and making sure that they can do some of the qualifications. I mean, people don't like me saying this, but I'm going to say it. You cannot be a chief executive if you have not run the P&L of a company, if you have not run the operational side.
So there's a pipeline issue perhaps?
Absolutely, and do not keep putting women into the HR pipeline. Not that there's anything wrong with HR, human remains, I used to describe it when I was a public servant, but you cannot be a chief executive of a corporation if you have not come up through the line of the business. That is just the simple reality. Now, there'll be very different views on that, but I think I know a lot about this. So I think we've got to get the pipeline right. Companies that are doing this really well, we put out a report with McKinsey a couple of years ago, are doing things like really actively managing that pipeline, really taking a risk on some women in those P&L jobs, making sure that they kind of support people with the training, the qualifications, so that they're successful in their roles. We've got a long way to go on this. I don't think quotas is the answer to that, but we may end up there if we don't make progress. Targets certainly are, and I encourage companies to set targets, but I think this has got to be a long-term serious endeavour by the business community to get women into those leadership positions. But it's not a question of just plucking them in, it's a question of developing so that they are successful as well. What I hated in that discussion about AMP was this awful conversation, well, that's what happened when you put women on boards. My God, that it was just such a shocking conversation, as opposed to there were very systemic issues in that company. We've got to make sure women are successful in leadership positions, not that just simply that they're sitting in a seat.
Thank you both for speaking. My name's Paul. I'm a journalist at The Age. Jennifer, two very quick questions for you. Firstly, Bill made a point about stimulating demand being easy if companies granted wage growth with a figure of 3 or 4 before the % mark. Would that be something you support, companies being more generous? And I'll just ask the next one very quickly. The Woolworths CEO today talked about a simplification of the IR system being able to potentially avoid situations of wage theft. Would that be something you would push for?
Well, let's take them in tandem. First of all, to get higher wages, you've got to have higher productivity. Now, I think if you looked at the big corporations, you'd see those 3% in their EBA. So people who use the EBA system overwhelmingly are higher paid. And we should do that. You can't simply just pay people more if the demand isn't growing, if the business isn't growing, if the productivity isn't growing. Because it has to be found somewhere else. You either reduce your take to shareholders, you increase your prices, you reduce the number of people working. So this has got to be a carefully calibrated thing. And that's what the EBA process was there to do. And that's why it breaks my heart to see it falling apart. On the Woolworths stuff, and clearly the company has rightly apologised today. They found it. They are going to fix it. They have apologised. We do need to make sure, though, that we are not creating a system that is so complex, 122 awards, multiple agreements, multiple clauses, so that it is vulnerable to inadvertent payroll mistakes. But we have supported, as the BCA, the penalties for purposeful wage theft. We think it's a very serious issue that should be cracked down on as hard as we can. At the same time, let's not make the system so complicated, particularly for SMEs, where you might find a small business that's got 8 or 15 awards that they're managing in their payroll system. We've got to get that balance right.
Can I just say productivity has increased since the GFC by 8%. 8%. Wages have increased in real terms by 1%. By 1%. Superannuation has been increased, and I was actually wrong with Swan. It was actually only increased by 0.25, increased by 0.5%. So what you've had since the GFC is a fundamental shift and change in the Australian economy as you had in the world economy, in which productivity is actually not being distributed. It's actually not being distributed because the bargaining system is not working effectively. That's the cause. The bargaining system is not working effectively for the reasons perhaps been outlined. But that's the truth of the matter. That's the truth of the matter. Now, I've heard from day one as a union official, employers say to me, oh, the award system is very hard to work. Well, I don't know. It seems to me it's not that hard. It just requires reading, mainly. Mainly reading, and you go through the award and you can see whether it's enforced. Now, there's a lot of very good employers, but there's a lot of bad employers. A lot of bad employers in this country who don't want to pay the award rate. Now, the unions are necessarily and rightfully fighting those people. Now, there's no pretending that that's the case, not the case. Now, if somebody comes along and got a great solution for you, make the award simple and we'll actually reduce people's entitlement so that we don't have these problems anymore. Look, they're all good cooks, some of them, but perhaps, if you're smart enough to get a recipe and make something, you're bloody smart enough to read the award, I reckon. So I don't have a lot of excuses for these people. If you're committed to pay the award, you pay it. And the award rates are quite high in relative terms, and there's some really good conditions, but that's the Australian system. That is the Australian system. So productivity, Hawke, a great advocate. The reason he was a great advocate, he said that the wages system starts with 2 premises. You increase wages in accordance with prices to make sure everybody, then you share the productivity gain in addition so that you get an increase in real wages. It's a share of productivity. So productivity rises by 8% over a period of time then wages should rise by 8%.
Okay, let's see if we can get one more question in before we finish.
Hi. So as a young person, as a worker and a union member, I feel that the elephant in the room is neoliberal economic policy and its role in, I guess, busting unions and decimating the working class over, say, the last 30 years. If we acknowledge that union density has declined, but productivity has continually increased over that time, then isn't it a bit of a false equivalence to say that it is unions' role and businesses' role to come together to solve these problems that are facing young people now in the working class, when one side of that equation has a lot more power, has a lot more lobbying power for governments to create legislation and to impact the economy more than the other side?
Jennifer?
Well, I think people would dispute that final comment, to be honest. I think people would dispute that power change. I think that at an individual level, I absolutely agree. That's why I'm a supporter of unions. I'm a supporter of the collective process. I mean, this conversation about neoliberalism, which is the new thing, which is basically, do we kind of support markets? Do we support, you know, a low role of government? Do we support lower regulation? What's the alternative to that? I mean, you know, that's my concern when people say, let's get rid of whatever their version of neoliberalism is. You know, that is not going to solve the ambition of young people today. You know, and that's what the election told us, that people had ambition for the country, that they wanted to get ahead. And I've been out talking to people in the regions for the last 2 years. I rarely, in fact never, when I go out into the country regions, hear people talking about an anti-business agenda. You know, you go to Adelaide, people say there's only one thing wrong with big business in Adelaide, we don't have any. You know, they want businesses investing. They want businesses to be there putting money in, creating a job for a young person where unemployment for young people is very high. I just don't know what the alternative is but to work together to create that future that you want and that I want, that people can have a good job, a better job, a good job for their life. If we and the employers and the unions do not work together, I do not know what the alternative is. Bill?
Look, I don't think we have a neoliberal society, and we've never had it. We've never had it. So I'm not into those slogans. We have a system, we've got national health care. The most socialist policy a country can have is looking after its people health care. We have a national superannuation system. We have the highest minimum ward rates in the total structure in the world. This is not neoliberalism. This is a form of old-fashioned socialism which says that everybody in our society should be protected. We have an education system which gives people more opportunities than many. So I've never accepted that view. I have never been in that camp. I've always been in the camp as let us be a productive nation, high levels of productivity, but share that to make sure everybody gets it.
Exactly.
So I'm an old-fashioned socialist and a modern marketer. So that's Hawke, that's Keating, that's Labor. What the point you make is this, however, should not be ignored and it should not be dismissed by that ideology that I've just said. What has happened to the GFC since the GFC is this, is that the ability to bargain is less, the ability to bargain, because the Labor government did a terrible job when Gillard and Rudd was there in fixing the right to bargain. They did a terrible job. I've got to be frank about it. You know, I love the Labor Party, but if that's the best that they can do to ensure that unions have a proper right to bargain, that was a terrible job that they did. And that is what the ACTU was saying. Perhaps they shouldn't have, because they're trying to be nice to people, their own people, they didn't say, why we want to change the rules, because the rules we want to change is that the system wasn't good enough to make bargaining work effectively. It's too complicated. And about that you are absolutely right. The bargaining system is not a fair bargaining system for unions. About that you are absolutely right. Because what you can see is that you can see it in the trajectory. Real wages improve through bargaining really well in this country. Minimum rates struggle, but they at least keep there. We implement even the SGC, we're still implementing it. Living standards are rising, not at the rate of productivity, but at least they're rising dramatically, and there's a huge improvement in the living standards of workers. The GFC hits, then workers don't bargain, they can't bargain, the minimum rates continues to rise as a protection, and they defer super. So part of your argument is absolutely right. That is, you've got to change the bargaining system to make sure it's more effective. But in the end, bargaining is two things. Bargain against bad employers who don't pay the rate, bargain constructively with good employers who wants to increase productivity. The bargaining system's got to be both. It's got to incorporate both of those things. And what is happening to society is workers are being left behind in that process. They are being left behind. And the other thing that's happening is if you are a very good bargainer, then certain workers are getting huge wage increases while others are not. Well, not. So I think Australia's a very unusual society. It's a very unusual society and has been for a long time. We rejected the third way. We rejected the free market. We're not subject to the same neoliberal forces. We've got those national institutions that work, but where are the trends going? I think you're right. Where you've got to divert them is divert back to where we were going. That is, be more productive, more cooperative, make sure that the bad employers are beaten up, given unions got better rights to bargain, but use it constructively.
We're
And
now
Australia-
running into
and
overtime.
Australia will be better off as a nation.
We're running into double time, and I think we all know what that means from a work perspective. I apologise to those that still had questions. We have come up to the top of the clock. Please join me in thanking our eminent guests, Bill Kelty and Jennifer Westacott. And thank you also to you for a lively discussion, and to the La Trobe staff that have organised this series. And just a reminder that the next La Trobe event as part of the Bold Thinking series is on Thursday, the 21st of November, with the question, is body tech the new frontier of humans? Thank you very much for coming out tonight, and I can see that we had a very rich discussion. We didn't even get on to climate change and moral leadership, but we had a fine discussion with our two eminent speakers. Thank you.